Along the lower curves of the Mississippi River, where the water slows and darkens before slipping past New Orleans, there exists a story that never appeared in official textbooks and rarely surfaced in polite conversation. It is a story stitched together from court ledgers, plantation records, private letters, and the whispered memories of people who are never meant to be heard. In the 1840s, Louisiana was a place built on appearances. Wealth was measured in land and sugar. Respectability was measured in silence, and anything that threatened the racial order was quietly removed before it could be named. What follows is not legend in the traditional sense. It is a reconstruction of something that was deliberately hidden. In 1846, a physician named Dr. Auguste Levine arrived in New Orleans from Charleston. He was in his early 40s, unmarried, precise in his habits, and deeply committed to record-keeping. Levine was not wealthy, but he was respected enough to be contracted by several plantations along the German coast and in St. Charles Parish. His job was simple in theory: attend births, treat injuries, certify deaths, and keep medical records that plantation owners could present as proof of proper care. Like many doctors of the era, he accepted slavery as a fact of the world he lived in, but he did not stop observing it. Within his first year working on plantations, Levine noticed something unusual. Enslaved women with visibly African features were giving birth to infants whose skin was strikingly pale. Some had light hair. Some had gray or blue eyes. Mixed ancestry was not rare in Louisiana, but these children showed no obvious markers that would have categorized them as black under the rigid logic of the time. Levine initially assumed coincidence, or perhaps errors in his own perception, but the pattern repeated itself, plantation after plantation, parish after parish. Levine did what he always did when something troubled him. He wrote it down. In a private ledger separate from his official medical books, he began documenting each case in detail. He recorded the mother's name, age, plantation, and physical description. He described the child's appearance carefully, noting skin tone, hair texture, and eye color. He included dates, witnesses, and in some cases the acknowledged paternity of white plantation owners who did not deny their involvement, at least in private. By 1847, the ledger contained dozens of entries, and alongside the births, Levine began recording something else. The children were disappearing. In some cases, he was told the infant had died within days. In others, he was told the child had been sent away for special care. But Levine noticed the same details repeating. There were no burial records, no small graves near the quarters, no mourning rituals among the enslaved women who knew death intimately and marked it in ways that could not be mistaken. Instead, there was silence, abrupt, enforced silence. Levine raised quiet questions with plantation overseers. He asked about death certificates. He asked where the bodies had been taken. The answers were vague, impatient, and sometimes hostile. Eventually, word reached him through enslaved midwives and domestic workers that these children were not dying at all. They were being removed, taken at night, passed along to intermediaries, erased. By the summer of 1847, Levine understood that he was looking at something systematic, not isolated cruelty, but an organized process. He believed there was a network operating across multiple parishes, involving plantation owners, local officials, and buyers outside Louisiana. The purpose was simple and horrifying. Children who could pass as white were being extracted from slavery and sold into white families as orphans or distant relations. Their origins were buried, their mothers silenced, their identities rewritten. Levine knew what it meant to document this. He knew the law would not protect him. Still, he continued. He copied pages from his ledger and hid them in the lining of his mattress. He kept the original close at all times in a leather portfolio. He even wrote a long letter explaining everything he had learned, sealing it into the ledger itself, a message meant for someone who could no longer answer him. 2 weeks later, his plantation contracts were quietly terminated. 3 weeks after that, Dr. Auguste Levine walked out into the night carrying his portfolio and never returned. The official report stated that Dr. Auguste Levine had drowned after drinking too much whiskey, a regrettable but unremarkable end for a man without powerful friends. His body was pulled from the river, snagged between the rotting pilings of a dock just before dawn, coat heavy with water, boots still on his feet. A bottle lay nearby, carefully placed, almost theatrical.
Witnesses were produced who claimed they had seen him drinking alone the night before. The authorities accepted the explanation without resistance. There was no inquest worth the name, no serious examination of the bruising along his arms, no explanation for why his leather portfolio was missing while his medical bag lay torn open nearby. At his boarding house, the landlady told police that two well-dressed men had visited Levine's room the evening he disappeared. They spoke politely, introduced themselves as colleagues, and said they had been sent to collect his papers for family members. They paid her for her trouble. Only later did she realize how thoroughly the room had been stripped. Clothing remained folded in drawers, books sat untouched on shelves, but every loose page, every note, every scrap of writing was gone. The mattress had been slit open, its lining ripped out and discarded. Whatever Levine had hidden there was taken or destroyed. He was buried in an unmarked grave reserved for strangers and paupers. His remaining possessions were sold to cover unpaid rent. Within weeks, his name vanished from professional records. It was as if the man himself had been erased. But the thing he had documented did not end with him. Across Louisiana and into Mississippi and Alabama, the same pattern continued. Enslaved women gave birth to children whose appearance disrupted the rigid categories of race. Those children vanished. Sometimes the mothers were told their babies had died. Sometimes the infants were taken so quickly that no explanation was offered at all. Among the enslaved population, the truth spread quietly, through whispered conversations in kitchens and fields, through glances exchanged during church services and market errands. A shared understanding formed. These children were not dead, they were being taken and remade. The grief this created was different from other losses under slavery. When a child was sold to another plantation, there was at least the knowledge that they still existed somewhere in the world. Names could be remembered, stories could be carried forward. But these children were being erased entirely. Their mothers understood that their sons and daughters would grow up believing a lie so complete it would replace the truth. They would never know their real names. They would never know the women who had carried them, fed them, loved them for the brief moments they were allowed to exist. The system behind it was brutally efficient. Plantation owners who fathered children with enslaved women faced a contradiction. These children were legally property, but their appearance threatened the illusion that whiteness and freedom were inseparable. A pale child born enslaved exposed the violence and hypocrisy beneath the plantation economy. Selling the child as white solved the problem. The mother was silenced by force. The buyer received a child without scandal. The paper trail vanished. Some buyers convinced themselves they were rescuing orphans. Others understood perfectly well what they were purchasing. Middlemen handled transportation and forged documents. Local officials looked the other way. Parish records were altered or destroyed. The law, which refused to recognize enslaved people as full human beings, ensured that no testimony from the mothers would ever matter. For years, the system operated without challenge. Then, in the early 1850s, it brushed against someone it could not erase so easily. Her name was Henriette Delacroix. Henriette was a free woman of color living in New Orleans, born free, educated, and careful in every aspect of her life. She ran a small dressmaking shop in the French Quarter and earned a reputation for fine needlework and discretion. Free people of color occupied a precarious space in Louisiana society, tolerated but never secure. Henriette understood this. She avoided controversy, paid her taxes, carried her freedom papers at all times, and spoke carefully in public. Her younger sister, Margot, had been born free as well and supported herself by teaching music. For years, their lives followed a narrow but stable path. Then a legal challenge arrived from across the ocean, raised by a distant white relative eager to reclaim property long thought settled. A judge ruled that their mother's manumission decades earlier had been improperly granted. With a single decision, the past was rewritten. Margot was declared enslaved. Henriette was spared, not out of mercy, but calculation. Enslaving both sisters would attract attention. Taking one was profitable and quiet. Margot was sold within days to a sugar plantation owner in St. Charles Parish. Henriette watched from the crowd as her sister was inspected, priced, and led away. The law offered no appeal that could save her. It was only later, through the same whispered networks Levine had once relied upon, that Henriette learned the most dangerous truth of all. Margot was pregnant.
By the time Henriette managed to send word to the plantation where Margot had been taken, it was already too late to intervene. Letters moved slowly and unreliably through the post-war South, and even in peacetime, correspondence involving enslaved people was often ignored or intercepted. When a reply finally came months later, it was brief and deliberately vague. Margot had given birth to a daughter. The child, the overseer claimed, had been sickly and had not survived. No details were offered, no grave was mentioned, no name was recorded. Henriette did not believe a word of it. She began traveling whenever she could, inventing business reasons to justify her movements. She visited markets, churches, and neighborhoods where enslaved people were allowed to gather under supervision. She listened more than she spoke. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Margot was not the first woman to lose a pale child under similar circumstances. Other women described the same sequence of events: a quick removal, a whispered explanation, and then silence. Some claimed to have seen white families arriving at plantations shortly after such births. Others spoke of infants transported at night, wrapped in fine blankets, escorted by men who were not overseers. The stories were inconsistent in detail, but identical in shape. Henriette began keeping notes: names, dates, locations. She wrote in a small, tight script and used coded language, aware that discovery could cost her freedom or her life. She cross-referenced rumors with parish records and shipping manifests. She tracked which families suddenly acquired infants without pregnancies. She noticed that the same physicians appeared again and again in the background, certifying deaths that no one had witnessed. One name surfaced repeatedly, spoken with caution and resentment: Dr. Augustus Levine. Levine was known among the enslaved population as a man who asked questions. He recorded details others ignored. He sometimes argued with plantation owners over treatment and payment. His reputation was dangerous. It made him useful to those who wanted answers and threatening to those who wanted silence. Henriette managed to arrange a meeting through an intermediary who risked a beating just by carrying the message. They met in the back room of a Quaker-owned apothecary, a place that quietly offered assistance to those the law refused to protect. Levine was older than Henriette had expected, his hair already thinning, his hands stained with ink as much as medicine. When she told him about Margot, he did not interrupt. When she described the pattern she had uncovered, he did not look surprised. "I have seen this before, more times than I can count." He showed her portions of his ledger, pages he had kept hidden from plantation owners. There were dates, names of women, descriptions of infants, and notations that stopped short of accusations but made their meaning clear. Deaths recorded without bodies, fees paid by men who did not appear in official contracts, transfers disguised as medical consultations. Levine believed the operation had been running for decades. He suspected it was expanding. The two of them began sharing information cautiously, never meeting in the same place twice, never carrying full records at once. Henriette focused on tracking the children after they disappeared. Levine focused on documenting the births and the falsified deaths. Each understood that exposure would bring consequences neither could survive alone. It was during this time that Henriette caught a glimpse of the truth she feared most. While delivering a finished gown to a wealthy household in the Garden District, she was asked to wait in the courtyard. From there, she could see into a sunlit garden where a small child was playing under the supervision of a nurse. The girl could not have been more than 5. She had pale skin, light brown hair, and a familiar tilt to her head that made Henriette's breath catch painfully in her chest. The child's name, she later learned, was Charlotte. She belonged to the household of Judge Armand Beaumont, a man of influence, reputation, and carefully cultivated respectability. His wife was known for charitable works. Their family was considered beyond reproach.
The child had been presented to society as a distant relative taken in after a tragedy. Henriette stood frozen in the courtyard, her parcel forgotten in her hands. She did not approach the child. She did not speak her sister's name aloud. She understood instantly that doing so would accomplish nothing except her own destruction. Instead, she watched as Charlotte laughed and ran across the grass, healthy, loved, and entirely unaware of the lie she was living. That night, Henriette added a new name to her notebook. She never told Margot what she had seen, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood the cruelty of knowledge without power. To tell Margot would be to reopen a wound that could never be healed. It would offer no reunion, no justice, only the unbearable certainty that her child was alive and unreachable. As the months passed, Levine grew more agitated. He spoke openly of going to the press, of taking his records north where the influence of Louisiana planters would carry less weight. Henriette urged caution. She had lived long enough under fragile freedom to know how quickly protection vanished. But Levine was no longer willing to wait. "If I stay silent, then I am no better than they are," he told her during their last meeting. Within weeks, he was dead. Henriette did not attend the funeral. She understood that being seen would invite questions. Instead, she returned to her shop, closed the shutters, and rewrote every note she possessed from memory. She knew that Levine's death was a warning. It was meant for her as much for him.
But instead of silencing her, it changed her purpose. If the truth could not be spoken aloud, it would be preserved. She committed herself to creating a record that could survive her, one that could not be dismissed as rumor or grief. She wrote names again and again, committing them to paper with a discipline born of rage and love. She documented what she could confirm and clearly marked what she could not. She wrote not as an accuser, but as a witness. And she did so knowing that she would likely never see justice in her lifetime. Years passed, and the city continued as if nothing had happened. New Orleans thrived on forgetting. Wealth flowed through its ports, music spilled from its courtyards, and the same families who had profited before the War of Conscience continued to host dinners, fund churches, and shape the law. Judge Beaumont's career only improved. His rulings were cited with respect, his opinions reprinted in legal journals, his name spoken with admiration. Charlotte grew into a young woman admired for her beauty and refinement, her origins never questioned. Henriette watched all of this from a careful distance. She relocated north not long after Levine's death, understanding that her continued presence in Louisiana increased the risk of discovery. With the help of Quaker contacts who recognized the danger she was in, she settled first in Pennsylvania, then briefly in New Jersey, before finally establishing herself in Philadelphia. There, she found a community that valued documentation, quiet resistance, and moral persistence. She earned her living with needlework, as she always had, but her real labor took place at night. She wrote. She reconstructed events from memory and correspondence. She copied parish records by hand when allowed access. She interviewed formerly enslaved people who had fled north or been freed, listening patiently as they spoke of infants who vanished and mothers who were warned never to ask questions. She learned to distinguish rumor from pattern, grief from evidence. Over time, her collection grew into something more than notes. It became an archive. Each entry followed the same structure: the mother's name, if known, the plantation, the date of birth, the description of the child, and the circumstances of disappearance. When possible, she traced where the child had gone, noting adoptive families, new names, and the legal mechanisms used to legitimize the transfer. Often, the trail ended abruptly. In many cases, it never began at all.
What struck Henriette most was how deliberate the system had been. This was not chaos or isolated cruelty. It was a process refined through repetition. Doctors falsified records. Lawyers crafted paperwork that could not be challenged. Judges dismissed complaints as misunderstandings or hysteria. Ministers baptized infants without asking questions. Every institution that claimed moral authority had been quietly conscripted. And always at the center were men who understood the value of silence. The Civil War changed many things, but not everything. When slavery collapsed, the network did not end so much as dissolve. There was no need for secrecy once the legal framework that supported it was gone. The children were already absorbed into white society. Their identities were secure precisely because no one wanted to disturb them. The crime had no visible victim left to claim it. Henriette followed the war from afar, reading casualty lists and newspaper reports. She learned of Captain Hartwell's death months after it occurred. The notice was small and unremarkable. A man killed in battle, his service briefly summarized, his papers returned to family. She wondered if his notes would survive, or if they would be discarded as irrelevant relics of a past no one wanted to remember. When emancipation came, Henriette hoped briefly that truth might surface on its own. The Freedmen's Bureau worked tirelessly to reunite families torn apart by sale, but their mandate did not include children who had been reclassified out of existence. Pale children raised as white did not fit any category the government recognized. Their mothers had no proof. The law had already erased them. Margot was freed when the war ended, but freedom did not bring healing. She remained near the plantation where she had been held, working for wages that barely sustained her. She searched quietly, asking questions she knew would never be answered. Henriette wrote letter after letter, trying to locate her sister, but the chaos of reconstruction swallowed most correspondence. When news of Margot's death finally reached her years later, it arrived without ceremony, reduced to a single sentence passed through strangers. Henriette grieved alone. She continued her work into old age, aware that her body was failing, even as her resolve remained intact. By the time of her death, her collection documented hundreds of cases across multiple states. She had created a shadow genealogy, a record of lives rewritten and histories severed. She made arrangements for her papers to be preserved, insisting they be treated not as accusations, but as testimony. "They will say this is impossible," she wrote in one of her final letters. "They will say it is exaggerated or that it does not matter now, but the truth does not expire. It waits." Decades later, long after her name had faded from memory, the waiting ended. A historian searching through a neglected archive would find a ledger that should not have existed. Letters written in a hand that refused to be erased. Connections no one had bothered to conceal because they believed no one would ever look. And once seen, the story could not be unseen.
The discovery began quietly, the way unsettling truths often do. In 1979, Dr. Patricia Jennings had no intention of uncovering a crime buried beneath a century of silence. She was a careful, methodical historian, more interested in routines than scandals, in the mundane details of medical practice in antebellum Louisiana. Plantation medicine, midwifery, fever outbreaks, treatment logs, these were her concerns. She expected dust, repetition, and long days of disappointment. What she did not expect was a ledger. It was mislabeled, tucked inside a box of family correspondence donated decades earlier by the descendants of a prominent New Orleans judge. The leather cover was cracked and warped from water exposure, the pages fused together in places. At first glance, it looked like a typical physician's account book, names, dates, fees. But as Jennings gently separated the pages and began transcribing what remained, a pattern emerged that stopped her cold. The same descriptions appeared again and again. Enslaved women, newborns described as unusually pale, infants who died within days, often without explanation. The handwriting was precise, clinical, and relentless. 47 entries followed this pattern. 47 children. Jennings felt the weight of it immediately. Medical fraud was not unusual in the 19th century, but this was something else. Deaths that were not deaths. Absences too consistent to ignore. When she traced the name on the ledger's spine, she realized she was holding the original records of Dr. Augustus Levine, a physician whose suspicious death she vaguely recalled from old court references. Then she found the letters. They were folded carefully between pages, written in a tone that shifted from professional to desperate. One was addressed to a judge, another warned of danger.
The final letter, dated the day before Levine's death, was written to a sister who, according to public records, had died decades earlier. The implication was obvious. This was not personal correspondence. It was a safeguard. Jennings read it in a single sitting, her hands trembling as the scope of the accusation unfolded. Levine named names: plantation owners, lawyers, overseers. He described a system that did not merely exploit enslaved women, but erased their children entirely, converting them into white heirs and commodities. He implicated men whose portraits still hung in museums, whose names adorned streets and institutions, and at the center of it all was Judge Beaumont. Jennings understood immediately why the ledger had vanished and why Levine had ended up in the river. She also understood why the ledger had resurfaced now. The family that donated the papers had not known what they possessed. Time had weakened the secrecy that once protected power.
For 3 months, Jennings worked in near isolation, transcribing, cross-referencing, and verifying. She matched entries to parish records, property deeds, and census anomalies. She confirmed that Louisiana had no formal adoption laws during the period, allowing children to be transferred without documentation. She identified gaps in family trees where children appeared suddenly, without birth records, and were immediately folded into elite households. The more she looked, the larger the story became. Her first publication, released quietly in an academic journal, was cautious in tone but explosive in implication. She avoided speculation, let the documents speak, and framed the practice as a hidden form of racial reclassification. The response was immediate but restrained. Scholars debated methodology. Some praised her rigor. Others questioned whether the cases were representative or merely exceptional. Jennings knew better. She traveled north to Philadelphia and uncovered Henriette Delacroix's archive, preserved by Quakers who had understood its importance even if they lacked the means to act on it. She located Captain Hartwell's notes in a Boston attic, packed away after the war and forgotten by generations who never bothered to read them. She interviewed elderly descendants of formerly enslaved families who still carried stories about babies who vanished and grief that had no public language. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself. What Jennings had uncovered was not a rumor or an aberration. It was a coordinated practice protected by law, money, and silence. It had operated efficiently because everyone involved benefited, except the mothers, whose voices had never been considered admissible. When she finally published her book, it was not written as an indictment, it was written as a record. Names, dates, patterns, consequences. She understood that outrage fades, but documentation endures. The public reaction was muted. Some readers were disturbed. Others dismissed it as an artifact of a cruel past. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. People began to look at their own histories differently. Family stories were re-examined. DNA tests, decades later, would reopen questions no one had dared to ask. Jennings knew she would not see resolution in her lifetime, but that was never the point. The truth, once found, had been released back into the world.
The truth did not spread quickly, but it spread steadily, the way groundwater does, slow, invisible, impossible to fully contain. In the years following the publication of Jennings' book, letters began to arrive at her office from people who did not quite know why they were writing. Some had read a review and felt unsettled. Others had stumbled across her work while researching genealogy. A few had been urged by older relatives to make contact, pushed by half-spoken family secrets that had lingered for generations. Again and again, the same patterns emerged. A great-great-grandmother who appeared in records without parents. A child listed in one census as born in Louisiana, but with no birth certificate. Family Bibles with missing pages. Stories of orphans taken in by wealthy households with no explanation of how they arrived. Physical traits that didn't align with the neat European narratives families had long told about themselves. For many, the questions became impossible to ignore once genetic testing became accessible. Small percentages of African ancestry surfaced in people who had always believed themselves entirely white. At first, most dismissed it as statistical noise, but curiosity has a way of sharpening. When those same individuals began comparing timelines, locations, and names, the coincidences multiplied. Jennings worked with them when she could, though she was careful not to overpromise. She explained that the system she had documented was designed specifically to destroy traceability. The absence of records was not a failure of research, it was evidence of intent. Even so, she helped families map what could be mapped, guiding them through parish registers, estate papers, and the fragments that survived fires, floods, and war. One case stood out. A woman in her 60s, a retired school teacher from Louisiana, requested a meeting after recognizing a name in Jennings' book. Her family had long revered an ancestor who had been a respected jurist in the 19th century. Privately, her grandmother had told her a different story, one that contradicted everything written in official histories. As a teenager, she had been warned never to repeat it. Now, with the documents spread across Jennings' desk, the pieces aligned. The woman's ancestor had not simply adopted a child, he had purchased one. The child had been born enslaved, taken days after birth, and reintroduced to society under a new name. The woman wept, not out of shame, but disorientation.
"I don't know what this makes me," she said quietly. "I don't know where I belong." Jennings heard variations of that sentence many times. For descendants of the stolen children, learning the truth was not a revelation so much as a fracture. Their lives had not changed materially. Their memories were intact, but their sense of self, carefully constructed through stories of heritage and belonging, had been destabilized. They were confronted with the reality that race, as they had understood it, was not a biological certainty, but a legal fiction, enforced and manipulated by power. For descendants of the mothers, the pain took a different shape. Some families had preserved oral histories about infants who disappeared, about women who never spoke of certain pregnancies again. For them, Jennings' work did not uncover a secret so much as confirm a wound. It validated grief that had been passed down without context, sorrow inherited without explanation. Public institutions were slower to respond. Museums hesitated. Universities debated framing. Legal scholars argued that retroactive accountability was impossible. There would be no trials, no restitution, no official reckoning. The men who had built and protected the network were long dead, their estates dispersed, their reputations intact. Still, the story refused to disappear again. In St. Charles Parish, a small museum eventually incorporated an exhibit dedicated to the stolen children. It did not dramatize or accuse. It presented names, timelines, and copies of documents. At the center was a wall etched with the names of mothers, those known, and placeholders for those lost to record. Visitors often lingered there longest, tracing letters with their fingers, standing in silence. The exhibit ended with questions rather than conclusions. How many cases were never documented? How many children were taken without witnesses? How many Americans today are living with an inheritance they do not recognize? Jennings visited once near the end of her life. She stood before the wall for a long time, reading names she had come to know intimately through ink and paper. She understood that the work was unfinished and always would be. History rarely offers clean endings. What mattered was that the erasure had failed. The mothers had been silenced, but not forgotten. The children had been renamed, but not entirely lost. The lie had endured for generations, but truth, however delayed, had found its way back into the light. And somewhere, in families across the country, people were beginning to ask new questions about who they were and why the past had tried so hard to hide itself.